And despite everything we're hearing about COVID, there's an underlying problem that's still going on and potentially worsened by this pandemic, and that's the opiate epidemic. Thank you so much for accepting me to present at this incredible platform for women in science, which is awesome, and seeing the amazing talks that are given by Soapbox Science across from Canada to the UK. I absolutely love this, and I'm so happy to be a part of it. So to give you guys a bit of background on myself. So I am a medical physician as well as having done a PhD. Not in the conventional order of things. Usually people do medicine and PhDs at the same time, but my pathway is a little different, and I'll walk you guys through it. So I'm actually an internal medicine resident at McMaster University. So what that kind of means, I guess, if we were to relate it to Grey's Anatomy, I would be second season. So just the year after internship. And, but I don't cut people open. So I'm not a surgeon. And there's no McDreamy at McMaster. Overall, I would say it's an amazing experience. There is lots of stuff that you get to do in medicine, and the people I treat are people who are sick with problems with their internal organs. So their hearts, their kidneys, their lungs, anything that can kind of drive someone to be sick enough to come into hospital are usually the things that internists deal with. Now, my journey to medicine has been a different journey than most because I actually started as a researcher and a scientist. And I started actually, my interest in addiction and in research generally came from high school. So when I was in high school in Niagara, unfortunately, a few of my friends ended up getting into substance use problems. And unfortunately, even though I'm from a very small town, there's actually been about 5 people around my age who've passed away since we've graduated high school from opioid-related issues. So it's a pretty big problem, and it's actually even a bigger problem in terms of the world scale. So I already mentioned earlier tonight about 130 Americans die every day, about 8 Canadians die every day of opioid overdoses. And right now we don't really have any clear evidence on what the best treatment is. So when I went to undergrad in 2008, I actually started in social sciences. So I wanted to look at the human experience. So what drives people's actions, what drives people's decisions to use substances, and what are the barriers patients face when they're in treatment? And this actually led me to doing a lot of social sciences research, more qualitative research, interviewing patients, interviewing physicians, and people who work in addiction. And ultimately, it was actually my 4th year of undergrad, I discovered epidemiology, which is what I did my PhD in. And now epidemiology is everywhere in the world. Ever since COVID happened, now everyone knows who Dr. Fauci is. Everybody knows kind of what the word is, but not everybody really understands what it means. So epidemiology, I'll bring you to my first prop. This is a map of England from the 1800s. And in this map, there's little dots that you'll see all over the map. And a smart physician named Dr. Jon Snow, not the character from Game of Thrones, but actually a physician in the 1800s in England, went around and decided to map where everyone was dying from cholera. So millions of British citizens were dying of cholera, and they didn't know what the cause was. We didn't know it was a bacteria. We didn't know it was in the water. And how they figured out that it was in the water was this gentleman went around mapping the deaths and found most of the deaths were concentrated near a specific water pump. And that's when they started to determine where the source of disease was. And that's what epidemiologists do. We are detectives of disease. We look at the distribution of disease, so where it's distributed, and we look at the determinants, which are the reasons people get the disease. So I discovered this after taking a course, actually an anthropology course called Plagues in People, and I fell in love with epidemiology. So I wanted to look more into this, which led me to starting my master's in the Health Research Methods program at McMaster. and ultimately pursuing my PhD in this program as well. And what I wanted to look at was kind of, it stemmed a lot from high school of why are these people dying? Why are some people with opiate addiction doing well? And why do other people fail treatment? And how I answered that question, or actually looked into answering that question, was just looking at studies. So I'm a researcher that does studies of studies. So it's kind of like Inception. But essentially, I ended up looking specifically at what we call systematic review evidence. So what we do is we gather all of the evidence that's ever been done on any treatment, and we kind of combine it into a single paper, and statistically we can synthesize it. So instead of having one study looking at treatments for opiate addiction, I can take 50 studies looking at treatments and kind of combine those results together. So the first thing you have to do is actually figure out what treatments are we going to look at. So to treat opiate addiction, there's a few different options, and you guys may have heard of some of them. One being methadone, which is just a long-acting opioid. So patients who are addicted to heroin or fentanyl, you give them a longer one so they don't get that peak that they would normally get, that high. It just stays in their system for about 24 hours, and it reduces cravings and it reduces symptoms of withdrawal. Other treatment options include something called Suboxone, which is a newer treatment, which is as well an opioid. Additional ones that have been studied in the past have just been morphine. So patients who are addicted to fentanyl or heroin, why don't we just give them some morphine and kind of monitor them in a doctor's setting? And some trials actually out of Vancouver at UBC looked at, well, why don't we just give them heroin and see if that works for treating opiate addiction? So unbeknown to me, there's actually many different treatments. So what I wanted to do is figure out, well, which one's the best treatment? Which one can we give to the most patients that's going to have the best, I guess, effect, as we would call it? So what I did was I looked across a bunch of databases. I looked at over 6,000 different studies to try and narrow it down to the actual studies that looked at my question. And I found 60 trials. So a trial is what we call a randomized controlled trial. So this is when you randomize people, or I guess randomly assign people to getting treatment A or treatment B. So in my trials that I actually included, it looked at, okay, so if somebody's addicted to heroin, we can give them methadone, or we could give them a placebo, which is just a fake treatment. Or we could give them methadone and give them Suboxone. Or we could give them methadone and we could give them heroin. So there's tons of different combinations that have happened in the research and in the literature. And what I did was try and synthesize them, put them all together, and look to see out of these, which is the best treatment. And unbeknown to me, I was so dedicated, so ready to figure this out. I wanted to know what the best treatment was. The first kind of hurdle in answering this question was, well, how do we measure the effectiveness of the treatment? What should the outcome be, as a trialist or a scientist would kind of determine? And the problem was I couldn't actually put all this evidence together because every single study had a different way of measuring a goal of treatment. So some studies were like, okay, we'll give people methadone, we'll give people a placebo, and how we'll say this is the good treatment and this works is if patients stop using heroin. Other studies looked at it and said, okay, I'll give people methadone, I'll give people placebo, and we'll look to see at the end of the study who's still on methadone. We call that retention. Other studies looked to see if patients had jobs at the end of the study. Other studies looked to see if patients had good relationships with their families. So the thing with addiction is it's not like other health disorders where most trials, let's say if you're looking at a pill for high blood pressure, what you're going to measure at the end of the study is blood pressure. It's a very objective kind of standard outcome. But with addiction, there's a whole different range of ways we could say that something works. And so that was my first problem. So out of the 60 trials looking at treatments for opiate addiction, there were actually over 118 different outcomes measured. So I couldn't even meaningfully compile them into a single kind of statistical estimate because they're all measuring different things. That was kind of the first hurdle. So all of these studies didn't have a common or a standard measure of effectiveness. And first of all, nobody actually went to patients to say, well, what do you guys think your goal of treatment is? What should we be studying? So that was the first problem. The second problem I noticed was when I was combing through these studies and kind of reading them very carefully, was one of the actual patients that were included in the studies. So when I looked at all of these different trials, I noticed, these trials have very strict inclusion and exclusion criteria. So these are the criteria people need to meet to get into a study. So all studies will have criteria of who can be allowed in the study. Usually studies will say, you have to be greater than 18 years old. Maybe you can't have other health conditions that would affect the results of the study. And all studies will have some criteria. What was interesting, though, was studies looking for the best treatment for addiction had very strict criteria of who to include. So 60% of all the trials that I had accumulated to look at the evidence excluded patients who have any mental health problems. In fact, 30% of the trials, so quite a big chunk, excluded patients who use other substances. And even 10% of the trials excluded patients who smoke. In the end, I was reading these studies and I was like, I don't even know who these patients are. Like, I've never even seen them in clinic. Somebody who is addicted to opioids, who I want to pick a treatment for, but the evidence that's been generated has never been tested in someone with a mental health problem, someone with other substance use problems, someone taking any mental health medications like antidepressants. All these things made me kind of scratch my head going, well, none of this evidence is very generalizable. Like, if we were to think that these are all the patients with addiction here, these are like our general sample of everyone. Ultimately, the evidence generated, you probably can't see this, but only applies to this tiny little fraction of them. So that was another concerning thing about the evidence. And then in addition to that, I thought, okay, so we have all this evidence. It's not really being tested in the normal patients that we would see in clinic. It's not really, there's no standard way of measuring what a good treatment outcome is, because all the studies are measuring different stuff. Well, what are the clinical guidelines doing? That was kind of my next step in the process. And so what I did was I actually looked at all the clinical practice guidelines from Canada, the States, and the United Kingdom. And now clinical guidelines are kind of our holy grail. Like, this is how clinicians practice. This tells us what we should be doing. And ultimately, a lot of physicians don't have the time to read through 60 trials. They don't have 3 years to do a PhD and learn everything in the literature. So what we do is we actually rely heavily on clinical guidelines to do that for us. There's big guideline committees that get together, that sit down, that get tons of money from the government to say, okay, we're going to go through all the evidence and we're going to make recommendations for clinicians so they don't have to read all the evidence. So hopefully, I thought maybe the guidelines have captured some of these issues. But unfortunately, it was actually a very different story. In fact, the guidelines from CAMH and the guidelines from the United States barely even touched upon these issues. In fact, they didn't even cite half the studies I had included, so they were missing evidence. And then the second thing was they never even once said, well, be careful before you start treating someone with methadone who might also have concurrent depression, because most of the evidence hasn't been tested in these patients. So you should be sure that you get those issues under control as well. But so that was kind of disheartening as well. And then ultimately, though, the NICE guidelines from the UK did make this assessment. They had said a lot of the evidence that we have today hasn't been tested in patients who have depression or patients with cocaine use problems. So you best kind of keep that in mind while you're treating these patients. So ultimately, that was kind of my big journey through all the addiction literature. I ended up looking at all of these studies and saying our literature that we have is just a big old mess. The bottom line from all the research that I had done to date, which took years, probably more than 7 total, considering all that research I did in undergrad, and I'm no even closer to answering this question. We have a very large yet weak body of evidence. It hasn't been tested in the patients that need these treatments the most. And the measures they're using to say that a treatment is successful have never been confirmed by patients and are currently being measured in hundreds of different ways. And ultimately, the only evidence we do have is summarized in the clinical guidelines largely inaccurately. So in the end, kind of what I was left with was, well, you're just going to need to use your best clinical judgment, because at this time, we just don't have the right evidence to confidently say which treatment is most effective. So yeah, I think that pretty much summarizes most of my research. Yes, I would say, unfortunately, it's very split. So I have met some incredible mentors and clinicians I've kind of attached myself to, and like I think that they treat addiction the way I want to treat addiction, and that is, it needs, obviously advocacy, it needs the type of funding to go behind it. It needs not only you treat them and you give them maybe a drug to help with their addiction, but you need to get them counseling. You need to get them, like, it's a big societal issue. I think if more funding went towards, whether it's housing, whether it's, like different types of like treatment programs, community centers, this type of stuff would obviously improve it. But then there's also other clinicians who treat addiction very differently. And there's these methadone mills and these kind of clinics that get patients in and out super quickly. They don't offer like the counseling service that patients need. And those doctors bill a lot of money and be able to be able to see these patients really quickly, which is kind of where it's not nice. So there's a darker side to it too, for sure. I think my biggest takeaway of this, the whole experience that I didn't anticipate going into the research, was the lack of awareness of what patients find important. And I think that after reading all these trials and like seeing all these different ways that they were measuring kind of different outcomes, and not one person had ever thought to do a study looking at, well, what do patients find important? I found that definitely probably one of the biggest eye openers, and somewhere that I want to dedicate kind of my future research to, just because like all the time I didn't actually realize that all of the clinical trials we have, the people who set how we measure effectiveness are just trialists and scientists. But if you're dealing with patients and you're dealing with humans and you're dealing with social issues, they need to be a part of it. Like, stakeholders are not just pharmaceutical companies and physicians. Like, it's the people who are going to take these drugs. And in the end, there was a super interesting study they did at Mac, where they were looking at what patients were willing to risk for preventing a stroke. So there's drugs that we take to prevent strokes. They're blood thinners. And anyone who's at risk of having a stroke or who's had a stroke will be put on these blood thinners to prevent future stroke. And they actually did a study, because a lot of patients weren't being put on them because of the bleeding risks. But when they actually asked patients, how much are you willing to risk a bleed of your stomach or something to prevent a stroke? And patients were like, I will gladly take a stomach bleed if it leaves me in hospital, but as long as it prevents a stroke, because a stroke is so debilitating. So I think these are kind of examples of moments where we're making decisions on what to give patients, but they need to be part of that conversation, because it will totally change what we're willing to and how much risk we're willing to take to give them certain treatments. Take care. Thank you guys so much.